Start here. Okay. Good morning to everybody, and welcome from the Digital Media Hub here at the Vienna International Centre. Welcome to the launch of the 2021 Annual Report and Precursor Report of the International Narcotics Control Board. I'm Anne Thomas from the United Nations Information Service in Vienna, and I'm pleased to welcome you all here today. Welcome to the journalists who are joining us here in the room, and also those who are joining online and those watching the web stream on our YouTube channel. I would like to introduce to you the President of the International Narcotics Control Board, Jagjit Pavadia, who will present the report this morning. After the presentation, obviously, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. Those in the room can raise your hand, and we have a microphone here that you can use. And those who are joining through Teams, please write your questions in the chat box, and I will read them out loud. And please identify yourself when you're asking a question, your name and the name of your media organisation. And I would now like to hand over the floor to Madam President, Ms. Pavadia, to present the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Thomas. Good morning to members of the media here at Vienna International Centre and online. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the launch of the International Narcotics Control Board 2021 Annual Report and the 2021 Precursors Report. My name is Jagjit Pavadia, and I am the President of the International Narcotics Control Board. The International Narcotics Control Board, INCB, is the independent quasi-judicial body established in 1968 to monitor and support the implementation of the 3 United Nations Drug Control Conventions by governments. INCB does so in cooperation with governments to ensure availability of controlled substances for medical and scientific purposes, while preventing diversion, illicit manufacture, trafficking, and abuse. This includes supporting governments to ensure availability of medicines containing controlled substances in emergency situations, which is particularly relevant given the acute humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and neighboring countries. The International Narcotics Control Board is deeply concerned about this situation, with over 2 million refugees having fled from Ukraine. The acute and growing humanitarian needs resulting from this emergency situation require urgent action to ensure unimpeded access to medications, including medications containing internationally controlled narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. INCB issued a public statement on 28 February calling for urgent action to ensure the availability of controlled substances in Ukraine and neighboring countries. This includes opioid analgesics for the treatment of pain, substances for sedation for medical procedures, as well as medications for mental health and neurological conditions. It also includes controlled substances for drug substitution therapy. INCB reminded all governments that in acute emergencies it is possible to utilize simplified control procedures for export, transportation, and provision of medicinal products containing controlled substances. Competent national authorities may permit the export of medicines containing narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances to the areas in the absence of the corresponding import authorizations and/or estimates. Urgent deliveries do not need to be included in the estimates of the receiving country. On 1st March, INCB sent a written communication to all governments encouraging the use of the simplified control measures for controlled substances during these challenging times in order to speed up the export and delivery of these substances to the affected populations. Since the beginning of March, the board has received inquiries from a number of competent national authorities and the World Health Organization on the operation of these simplified control measures. The importance of timely supply of controlled substances during emergency situations is highlighted in a global issue in the INCB 2021 Annual Report. INCB has also released a publication of Lessons from Countries and Humanitarian Aid Organizations in Facilitating the Timely Supply of Controlled Substances During Emergency Situations on the basis of consultations. This document sets out procedures to follow during emergency situations. INCB is encouraging member states to review existing legislation and to allow for greater flexibility in the international trade of controlled substances during emergency situations. Having covered this urgent and important matter, I will now revert to my originally planned presentation, which will follow the structure of the annual report. The annual report presents an overview of the global drug situation and makes recommendations to governments on how to implement the provisions of the 3 drug control conventions. This year, the thematic chapter, Chapter 1, is on the topic of illicit financial flows related to drug trafficking and their impact on development and security. Chapter 2 is on the functioning of the international drug control system. Chapter 3 covers global issues and offers an analysis on the drug control situation in different regions. Chapter 4 presents recommendations to governments and international organizations. The INCB Precursors Report summarizes the action taken by governments and INCB to implement Article 12 of the 1988 Convention. Illicit financial flows are defined as money illegally earned, transferred, or used which crosses international borders with one or more of the following characteristics. The acts themselves are illegal, the funds result from illegal acts, and/or the funds are used for illegal purposes. Illicit financial flows related to drug trafficking threaten the political, economic, and social development and security of countries. To put this in real terms, in 2011, 2.7% of the global GDP, equivalent to $1.6 trillion US dollars, was laundered through the financial system. Additionally, illicit financial flows impact security because of the related violence and instability. In 2020, the impact of violence on the economy increased by 0.2% to $14.96 trillion US dollars, which is equivalent to 11.6% of the global economic activity. Illicit financial flows serve as the lifeblood of all aspects of trafficking. Curbing them is therefore essential to addressing drug trafficking around the world. It is for this reason that INCB has focused on this topic in its annual report. We make a number of recommendations to curb illicit financial flows related to drug trafficking. These include focusing on supply and demand reduction strategies that also address illicit financial flows, adhering to and implementing the relevant international instruments like the 1988 Convention, the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, International Convention for the Suppression and Financing of Terrorism, United Nations Convention Against Corruption, International Standards on Combating Money Laundering, and the Financing of Terrorism and Proliferation of the Financial Action Task Force. This also includes strengthening anti-money laundering measures. In addition, we recommend establishing specialized units or task forces, raising awareness and exploring the potential for using proceeds of asset recovery related to drug trafficking to expand the availability of drug prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation services, preventing the exploitation of newly emerging financial services, adopting transparency laws which combat impunity, and promoting a culture of accountability and transparency by including civic and moral values in educational curricula. Chapter 2 of the annual report reviews the functioning of the international drug control system. I will present just a snapshot. Adherence to the drug control conventions remains unchanged since the previous reporting cycle. As you can see, non-member states are primarily concentrated in Oceania and Africa. Those non-party states are urged to accede to the conventions as a matter of priority. The report refers to the substances recently included in schedules of the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, and the need to ensure that these changes are incorporated into national systems. On precursor chemicals, the INCB has recommended the international scheduling of 3 chemicals used in the illicit manufacture of fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances. Fentanyl is a highly potent synthetic opioid which is driving the overdose crisis in some parts of the world. INCB received a proposal from the government of the United States to schedule these three precursors. All governments were invited to submit information and comments which have been taken into account by INCB. The scheduling recommendation will be considered by the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna next week. Illicit drug manufacturing is evolving rapidly and requires swift action. INCB is supporting member states to enhance the operational use of Article 13 of the 1988 Convention through a successful multilateral cooperation to prevent and investigate diversion of specialized equipment used in illicit manufacture of drugs, and an awareness raising and guidance document. INCB resources are available to support national authorities in all 6 official UN languages, including INCB guidelines to prevent and investigate the diversion of materials and equipment essential for illicit drug manufacture. Now we turn to availability of internationally controlled substances. The COVID-19 pandemic has tested the international community's ability to ensure access to and availability of the internationally controlled substances. The global supply chain of medicines has been affected by 2 things. First, relates to disruptions in the manufacturing of key starting materials of active pharmaceutical ingredients in connection with border closures, and secondly, other social distancing policies adopted by countries. INCB statistics show that there was an increase in the consumption, manufacturing, and stocks of some substances, specifically fentanyl and its analogues, in 2020. This increase has been driven by the need to provide pain relief and sedation for patients with COVID-19 admitted into intensive care units. A number of psychotropic substances, such as midazolam, have been proven to be crucial in the treatment of severe cases of COVID-19. Midazolam is a substance that is widely used for the sedation of patients within COVID-19 in intensive care units and is included in WHO's model list of essential medicines. At the outset of the pandemic, there were reported shortages of medicines containing midazolam. However, data provided by member states to INCB indicates that the situation improved. In the annual report, we highlight that gaps in the consumption of opioid analgesics persist between regions, with almost all consumption concentrated in the developed countries of North America and Europe, as shown in the graph on consumption of morphine. In other regions, the level of consumption is often insufficient to meet the medical needs of their populations. In the annual report, we note that the availability of opiate raw materials for the production of narcotic drugs at the global level remains sufficient to cover the global needs reported by governments through the estimate system to INCB for 2021 and 2022. However, there are significant disparities in the availability of narcotic drugs between countries, as many countries do not correctly estimate their medical need for opioid analgesics or have limited access to them. Our INCB learning program is building the capacity of national authorities in this area. We come to the INCB GRIDS program. Through the INCB Global Rapid Interdiction of Dangerous Substances program, or GRIDS for short, we are supporting member states' responses to the trafficking of new psychoactive substances and non-medical synthetic opioids. During the last reporting cycle, 750 officers from 84 member states and international organizations received training, and through GRID's work on public-private partnerships, hundreds of vendors of dangerous substances were removed from e-commerce platforms. INCB is encouraging governments and their industry partners to voluntarily refrain from any manufacture, marketing, export, import of substances on the INCB lists of fentanyl-related substances and non-fentanyl opioids and other new psychoactive substances, as these substances have no legitimate use. In 2021, INCB coordinated Operation New Horizon, which brought together 70 member states, Interpol, the World Customs Organization, and the Universal Postal Union with the aim of reducing the trafficking of drugs through international post, express mail and courier services, and freight forwarders. During this operation, more than 230 communications were exchanged through INCB's Ionics platform, leading to the seizure of 113 kgs of tramadol and 194 kgs of tapentadol. Global issues relating to legalization, decriminalization, and depenalization. Chapter 3 of the annual report contains an analysis of drug-related issues and an analysis of the world drug situation and developments in different regions. The first global issue relates to the conceptual differences between legalization, decriminalization, and depenalization. We highlight the need for a shared understanding of these concepts in line with the 3 drug control conventions. While the conventions do not contain definitions of these concepts, they do contain provisions that cover legal and policy frameworks to address drug-related behaviors. In short, decriminalization refers to the process where an offense is reclassified from criminal to non-criminal through legislative action. Depenalization, on the other hand, may include adopting mechanisms such as police diversion practices, conditional sentences, and widening prosecutorial discretion as alternatives to prosecution while the behavior remains a criminal offense. INCB emphasizes that proportionality should be the guiding principle in drug-related criminal justice matters. We also reiterate that regulation and commercialization of the non-medical and non-scientific use of internationally controlled substances is in violation of the drug control conventions. Use of social media in promoting non-medical drug use. The next global issue highlights how social media platforms promote the non-medical use of drugs by glamorizing such drug use. This is of great concern because young people are the main users of social media, and there is a link between social media usage and drug use. INCB encourages governments to work in partnership with social media platforms to take action against the exploitation of their platforms for the promotion or selling of illicit drugs. INCB also encourages governments to consider investing resources to develop and implement drug prevention programs and activities that utilize social media for dissemination of information. Manufacture and proliferation of fentanyl analogues. Fentanyl and its analogues continue to contribute to overdoses and drug-related deaths in some countries. Although the real extent of their damage is unknown, as fentanyl analogues in overdose deaths often go undetected and are therefore underreported. INCB makes some recommendations to governments in order to improve this situation, including preventing exploitation of legitimate industries and cooperation and sharing of information. Now we come to the regional analysis. Chapter 3 also contains an analysis of the drug situation in different regions of the world. However, due to time constraint, I will limit myself to only addressing 1 or 2 issues or developments in each region. In Africa, an increasing number of countries are permitting the cultivation of cannabis for medical and scientific purposes. Owing to demographic changes, the number of people who use drugs is projected to rise by 40% by 2030. Countries in Central America and the Caribbean began implementing the Organization of American States Hemispheric Drug Strategy 2020. This strategy is aimed at addressing transnational crime in an integrated manner, with a focus on public health and safety, taking into account gender, age, cultural context, and human rights. There was an observed increase in home deliveries of drugs in connection with COVID-19 measures. North America continues to experience an increasing number of drug overdoses and drug-related deaths. The COVID-19 pandemic, the contamination of drugs with fentanyl and synthetic opioids, and the decreased access to treatment and prevention services have contributed to the increased overdoses and deaths. Cannabis regulations in North America continue to shift towards regulation of use for non-medical purposes. South America saw larger quantities of cocaine and precursor chemicals seized in 2020 and 2021 as criminal groups increased shipment sizes to make up for lost profits during the first months of COVID-19 pandemic. More governments in the region regulated the cultivation and manufacture of and trade in cannabis for medical, scientific, and industrial purposes. The East and Southeast Asia region is challenged by the continued illicit manufacture of, trafficking in, and use of synthetic drugs. Several new and highly potent synthetic drugs have emerged. In South Asia, pharmaceutical opioids continue to be seized in large quantities, with the most commonly encountered being codeine and codeine-based cough syrups, tramadol, fentanyl, and methadone. The global trend of purchasing drugs over the internet, in particular on the dark net trading platforms using cryptocurrencies, continued to spread. The COVID-19 related lockdowns made it difficult for people with substance use disorders to access healthcare facilities. Regarding West Asia, Afghanistan continues to be the leader in illicit opium cultivation and production. Central Asian countries face increased trafficking in and use of synthetic drugs. There is a lack of data on prevalence of drug use in the region, affecting proper assessment of the situation. This year's annual report found that the restrictions related to COVID-19 pandemic had a limited impact on the supply and demand for drugs in Europe. Traffickers were able to adapt to pandemic restrictions, altering international trafficking routes and domestic distribution channels. Countries in Europe continue to adopt legislative changes, broadening the use of cannabis products for medical and scientific purposes. And finally, in Oceania, transnational crime, including drug trafficking, continues to increase in the Pacific Islands. Pacific Island states are emerging as transit points for trafficking in synthetic opioids to Australia, the United States, and Europe. Data on the prevalence of drug use and on treatment demand in Pacific Islands countries remains unavailable. We come to the recommendations. Chapter 4 of the annual report contains recommendations to governments, the United Nations, and relevant international and regional organizations. These recommendations cover the following areas: illicit financial flows related to drug trafficking, universal adherence to the drug control conventions, limiting cannabis use to medical and scientific purposes in line with the 1961 Convention, the International Drug Control Conventions and Human Rights, availability of controlled substances for medical and scientific purposes, and availability of controlled substances for humanitarian emergencies. We've also emphasized the strengthening prevention and treatment strategies, narcotic drugs, psychotropic substances, precursor chemicals, and the manufacture and proliferation of fentanyl analogues, materials and equipment used in the illicit drug manufacture, and social media in the promotion and prevention of the use of drugs. Now I come to the INCB's Precursor Report 2021 on the implementation of Article 12 of the 1988 Convention. INCB highlights the need to enhance precursor chemical control at the national level and national regulatory frameworks. In the absence of such controls, traffickers may attempt to obtain precursor chemicals by approaching unsuspecting chemical traders. About 1/3 of the governments had not established national control over all substances controlled under the 1988 United Nations Convention against illicit traffic in narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. Internet platforms continue to be used to procure chemical precursors. INCB conducted Operation Acronym in February 2021, focusing on suspicious online postings involving the precursors and pre-precursors of amphetamine-type stimulants and fentanyl. The operation highlighted the need for member states to place increased emphasis on cybercrime investigations relating to precursors, and the INCB is supporting member states in this regard by developing tools, resources, and other capacity building initiatives. The chemical and pharmaceutical industries are critical stakeholders in precursor control efforts due to the use of non-scheduled chemicals and designer precursors for illicit drug manufacture. The COVID-19 pandemic was found to have had minimal impact on the supply of chemical precursors for illicit drug manufacture. The continued decline in global reported seizures of ephedrine, viewed against reported seizures of MAPA, the latest substance to be added to Table 1 of the 88 Convention, confirmed the continuing shift towards the use of designer precursors. This was also seen with the precursors of fentanyl, fentanyl-related substances, and methaqualone. INCB notes that the timely sharing of information is essential if new trends are to be addressed proactively. INCB's PICS system serves as a platform for the exchange of actionable real-time information related to trafficking in precursors, including those not under international control. The system also provides important information on equipment used in illicit manufacture. Use of PICS has contributed to the identification of new trafficking routes and alternative precursors. Non-scheduled chemicals. The evolution of illicit drug manufacturing requires global action to address the proliferation of non-scheduled chemicals and designer precursors. Non-scheduled chemicals, the substances not listed in Table 1 and Table 2 of the 1988 Convention, and which can be used as alternatives for controlled precursors in the illicit manufacture of drugs, have now been encountered in all regions. Analysis of seizure data relating to recently scheduled designer precursors shows that seizures decreased significantly after their international scheduling. However, at the same time, new alternative non-scheduled precursors appeared on the market. This challenge is covered in the Precursors Report for 2021 and also as a global issue in the report. INCB has supported several initiatives and consultations to raise awareness of this problem and to build consensus on global action on non-scheduled chemicals and designer precursors. There is now overall consensus on the need for continued multi-stakeholder engagement on this problem as a priority issue for the international precursor control system. An option paper with a list of practical and concrete measures to address the challenge was disseminated to governments in August 2021 to help advance policy dialogue on the matter and was published by the board as a guidance document in February 2022. It is available on the board's website. Some of the options to address this problem are approaches within the international legal framework, national legislative and control measures, cooperation and exchange of information, public-private partnerships, technical assistance, capacity building, and awareness raising. I would like to thank you all for your attention during this presentation. Before taking any questions, I would like to emphasize that the implementation of INCB's recommendations will not only lead to meeting the objectives of the Drug Control Conventions, but will also lead to progressing on the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 3 concerning health and well-being, as well as SDG 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. Working together to meet commitments under the International Drug Control System and in implementing the board's recommendations, governments can positively support their commitment to promoting the health and welfare of humankind. We call upon governments to ensure that drug control measures fully comply with their commitments and obligations under the drug control treaties, as well as the international human rights standards and norms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'd now like to turn to the room and see if we have any questions here, and afterwards I'll look in the chat and see what we have. Please introduce yourself and your media. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Aurora Weiss. I'm here regarding the Styria media, and I have 2 questions.
I think you have to take off your mask.
Sorry, just wait for the microphone. Yeah.
And the mask.
And yes,
Can't
could
hear
you
her.
take off your mask while you ask the question? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Aurora Weiss. I'm here in name of Styria Media, and I have 2 questions. The first question is regarding legalization of opium in Ukraine. Is it a case of humanitarian crisis kind of legalization of opium in Ukraine in the moment? And second question, can you please give us some examples and tools in dealing drugs with cryptocurrency over the dark networks and also social media? Which are the tools that can be used as preventive in every country? Because I think that's the global problem in the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I didn't really understand your first question about legalization of opium in Ukraine. Yeah, could you kindly clarify?
So on the beginning of your presentation, you noted that you actually made some new recommendation script for Ukraine, and there was also mention on opium. Also, that was the question, will it be allowed to be used as a pain relief in Ukraine because of the war?
Thank you. I think you misunderstood my point. The point we were trying to make is that the opium is a controlled substance, so are other medicines, and we have only recommended the use of simplified procedures for movement of these medicines from different countries who want to give, humanitarian supplies to Ukraine. So it's not about legalization of opium per se, but it's about making available opium or their products like morphine and other, opioids, which we have in opium, for medicinal purposes. So not legalizing opium per se for Ukraine, but yes, for ensuring that these products reach the Ukrainian people for the humanitarian crisis they're facing at the moment. And the second question you asked me was, you wanted to have some examples of tools. So from time to time, we do hold various expert group meetings with competent national authorities where we guide them on how to work on these issues of cryptocurrency or even selling of drugs on the dark net, etc. So that we do with governments. And we note your suggestion if we can develop some tool, especially for social media, etc. We can work on that. Thank you very much.
Sharif, representing Horn of Africa News Agency. I am here also representing the UNCAF, United Nations Correspondents Association, and my question goes to Ukraine, because when you prepared your annual report, the Ukraine crisis was not a story. I am involved in humanitarian units receiving some Africans coming from Ukraine, and in the previous days, every day we are receiving 10 who are studying there, and from their stories, I could see how corruption increased at the borders. So I could imagine misuse of these facilities, thinking of money laundering and also drugs, because the dealers are faster than you. You mentioned special units. In these cases, I could imagine you need a very, very special units. Just my question, are you prepared for facing this new situation? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I would like to say that a lot of the relief is going through the World Health Organization, the Red Cross, and certain countries are sending these relief supplies to Ukraine. And I'm sure on the ground they have set up specialized units to monitor the distribution of medicines to the people who need it, and maybe to make it available to hospitals, as happens in emergency situations. The issue of corruption which you raised, I'm sorry, I can't comment on that, but it is a red flag which you have pointed out. And I think that the agencies involved will definitely take care that these relief supplies are not misused. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any further questions from the room? Then I look in the chat. There's no questions in the chat at the moment, but I wanted to ask you a question. I think the journalist raised it here, and maybe you could expand a little bit more on the point you were making about the social media platforms and how that's glamorizing drug use. If you could explain a little bit more about that and what you think are the steps that could be taken to counter that, and whether it's particularly prevalent on some social media platforms rather than others, or if it's across all the platforms.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a good question. In fact, social media platforms, I think almost all of them are seeing a rise of a tribe of people called social influencers, where YouTube videos are made or appeals are made on Instagram or Facebook to children, and they say that, oh, it's not harmful. They try to pose that. In fact, there was a study done of the link between social media and drugs, in which they found that they were glamorizing it by saying that it's better than alcohol because alcohol affects your liver, etc., but cannabis is harmless. So this is a general perception of the youth, and that is getting aggravated by the types of messages being put out on social media. And this is a dangerous trend. And your question about what can we do about it, we have suggested in our report that governments may try to monitor and police these media platforms, and also appeal to the media platforms themselves to monitor what is the type of content which is being put out, so that you don't have too much of this sort of glamorization of the use of drugs. And we've also suggested that these media platforms instead should be used for creating prevention programs and sending out a message to the youth about the ill effects of cannabis and other drugs, of course. You also have other synthetic drugs which are being sold on the net. And they also have ways of, communicating. Financing of these things has also become so much easier with Paytm and other e-wallet services, etc. So the paper trail is not there for the payments, etc. And that is where our illicit financial flows also links in with this subject, because it's so integral to the problem of drug trafficking. It is basically funding the criminal activities of drug traffickers, and it's also interlinked to other criminal activities which are not sacrosanctly separate, but also interlinked in the way they utilize that money for different purposes, like even human trafficking, arms trafficking. So these are all interfaced and facets of the same problem. Thank you.
Thank you. I just see, I think there's no questions in the chat right now. Are there any further questions from the room? No? In that case, I would like to add that the report and the press materials are now available on our website, and they're available in all the UN official languages. That's Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. And Madam President, I'd like to thank you very much for being here today and giving a very thorough presentation of the report. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.